Let me ask you something genuinely uncomfortable. Right now, as you're watching this video, Google knows what you searched before you clicked on it. If you have Gmail, it's read your emails. If you use Google Maps, it has a log of everywhere you've physically been for years, the coffee shop you visit every Tuesday morning, the medical clinic you drove to last month, the hotel you stayed at on your last vacation. And if you use Google Photos, it has scanned and analyzed the faces of everyone you've ever photographed, tagged their identities, and filed that data away inside a profile that gets richer every single day. I know that sounds like the opening of a tech paranoia video, and I want to be clear. This isn't that. I'm not here to scare you. I'm here to tell you what happened when I actually did something about it. 18 months ago, I made a decision that most people in my life thought was either extreme or pointless. I removed Google from every corner of my digital life, not reduced, not limited. Removed. And what I found on the other side was not what I expected. I expected friction. I expected compromise. I expected to spend 6 months missing Google and reminding myself why I left. What I actually found was that the ecosystem of alternatives that exists right now in 2026 is mature enough, polished enough, and in some cases genuinely better enough that 18 months later I have not returned to a single Google service as my primary tool in any category. Not one. And I want to walk you through exactly what that looked like. What was easy, what was genuinely hard, what alternatives worked, which ones disappointed me, and what changed in ways I never could have predicted before I made the jump. But before we get into the practical side of this, I need to explain the why, because without it, nothing else makes sense. Most people think of Google as a technology company that happens to also sell advertising. That framing is backwards. Google is an advertising company, one that generates roughly 90% of its revenue from ads. And it offers technology services as the primary mechanism for collecting the behavioral data that makes its advertising business possible. That distinction isn't semantic. It shapes every single product decision Google makes. When you use Gmail, Google analyzes the content of your emails. When you search, it logs every query and ties it permanently to your identity. When you use Google Maps, it builds a detailed physical record of your movements, the places you visit, how often you go, how long you stay. Google Photos uses advanced visual recognition to analyze every image you upload, identifying the people in them, the locations they were taken, the objects they contain, the activities they depict. Google Drive knows the contents of your documents. Chrome tracks your browsing behavior across the entire web, not just Google properties. Individually, each of these data streams is already intimate. Combined into a unified profile associated with your Google account, they produce a model of your behavior, your relationships, your beliefs, your habits, your health, your finances, and your plans that is staggeringly deep. And that profile is the product Google sells to advertisers. I don't say any of this to demonize Google. The people who work there are building genuinely impressive technology. But I reached a point where I understood the exact nature of what I was exchanging every time I opened Gmail or typed something into the search bar, and I decided I didn't want to make that exchange anymore. The question was whether opting out of it was actually livable. It is. Here's how. The first service I replaced, and the one I was most anxious about, was email. Gmail is the most widely used email service on the planet for a reason. It's fast, the search is excellent, the spam filtering is almost uncanny in its accuracy, and the integration with other Google services makes it feel like a frictionless hub for everything. Walking away from it felt like the highest stakes part of this whole experiment. The service I landed on was Proton Mail, built by Proton AG, a Swiss company founded by physicists who previously worked at CERN. Proton's entire business model is built around privacy as its core value proposition, not as a feature bolted onto a product whose real purpose is something else. The encryption architecture they use is end-to-end for emails sent between Proton users, meaning the content of those messages is technically inaccessible to Proton AG itself. They can't read it even if they wanted to. For emails sent to people outside the Proton ecosystem, in-transit encryption is available, and everything stored on their servers is encrypted with keys they control rather than leaving your content exposed in readable form. Here's what surprised me after 6 months of using it as my primary address. The transition was dramatically less disruptive than I braced for. The web interface is clean and genuinely well designed. Search within your inbox works well. Spam filtering handled my actual mail volume just as effectively as Gmail did. Yes, the integration with third-party services that rely on Google identity for sign-in doesn't exist, which meant spending several weeks systematically updating my email address on every service I used. That process wasn't dramatic. It was just methodical. A little tedious in the way that moving to a new apartment is tedious. You do the work once, and then you're done. What I did not miss, once that work was behind me, was Gmail at all. The anxiety I felt before making the switch turned out to be completely disproportionate to the reality of life on the other side of it. Search was a different story, more nuanced, more layered, and ultimately the category where my solution evolved the most over the 18 months. When I first left Google search, I switched to DuckDuckGo. If you've never used it, the core premise is simple. DuckDuckGo does not build individual user profiles, does not track your searches across sessions, and does not tie your queries to your identity. For the vast majority of everyday searches, factual lookups, news, product research, reference queries, the results are genuinely comparable to Google in quality and relevance. It handles those searches well. What I didn't expect was how much I'd come to rely on DuckDuckGo's bang commands, the feature that lets you prefix a search with an exclamation mark and a shortcode to search directly within a specific site. Type .yt before a search term and you're searching YouTube. Type .amz and you're searching Amazon. Wiki goes straight to Wikipedia. Once I built those into my daily habits, my search felt faster and more intentional for specific tasks, not slower. After 3 months with DuckDuckGo, though, I made one more move, to Kagi. Kagi is a paid search engine. You read that correctly. It operates on a subscription model funded entirely by its users, which means its business incentives are structurally different from every ad-supported search engine that has ever existed. Kagi earns money when its users find its results valuable enough to keep paying. It does not earn money by selling information about those users to advertisers. That alignment of incentives is not a minor detail. It shapes the entire direction of the product. The quality of Kagi's results for technical searches, long-form content, and queries where SEO-optimized content tends to dominate Google's rankings is noticeably better in specific categories. When I search for something genuinely obscure or deeply technical, Kagi surfaces primary sources and substantive content, where Google increasingly serves me content farms that have been optimized to rank rather than optimized to inform. The monthly cost is the real barrier, and I won't pretend otherwise. Paying for search feels strange when a generation of internet users has been trained to expect it for free. But free in the Google model means something specific. It means you're compensating Google with your behavioral data instead of with money. That's not free. It's a transaction where you just happen to be paying in a currency you can't see. I decided I'd rather pay in money I can see and keep my behavioral data out of the equation entirely. 18 months later, I have not opened Google Search as my primary search tool a single time. That surprised me more than almost anything else about this experience. Google Maps was the replacement I felt the most skeptical about before I started. And honestly, my skepticism was warranted. This one was harder than the others. Google Maps is exceptional at what it does. Local business data is comprehensive. The hours of operation are accurate. Real-time traffic is reliable. The navigation directions account for road conditions in ways that took Google years of data collection and iteration to get right. Its competitors have historically struggled to match it, and that gap was real for a long time. What I found when I actually lived with the alternatives for 18 months is that the gap has closed considerably, but it hasn't disappeared entirely, and I want to be honest about where the difference still shows. For mobile navigation, I switched to Apple Maps, and for offline navigation and desktop map queries, I use Osmand, which runs on OpenStreetMap data. Apple Maps in urban areas has improved substantially over the last few years. For the 90% of my map use cases, getting directions in cities I know, finding businesses, navigating routes I haven't driven before, it performs at a level that is functionally equivalent to Google Maps. The navigation is reliable. The data is current. The interface has gotten genuinely good. The 10% where I notice the difference involves smaller businesses in less densely mapped areas, where Google Maps' depth of local detail, precise hours, recent reviews, interior photos, is still more complete. That's a real limitation. I'm acknowledging it directly. But it was not enough to send me back, because the 90% covers essentially everything I actually needed in daily life. What leaving Google Maps also meant was opting out of the most physically intimate form of Google's surveillance. Google Maps wasn't just tracking where I searched for directions. It was building a continuous log of my physical movements through passive location data. Knowing that log no longer exists is not a trivial feeling. Google Drive and Google Docs presented a different kind of challenge, one that depends heavily on your specific workflow and where I want to be especially honest, rather than overselling the alternatives. I replaced Google Drive with Proton Drive for cloud storage, paired with local software for document editing. For my particular situation, where most of my document work is individual rather than collaborative, this worked well. Proton Drive's encryption model means the contents of what I store there are not accessible to Proton AG in readable form, which is precisely what I wanted. But here's what I'm not going to pretend. If your work depends heavily on real-time collaboration with multiple people simultaneously editing shared documents, Google Docs is genuinely difficult to match. The collaborative experience in Google Docs, multiple cursors, instant sync, the reliability of that sync under normal conditions, represents years of engineering investment that alternatives have not fully replicated. The friction is real. If you regularly work with teams inside Google Workspace who are not willing or able to change their tools, This is the category where you will feel the gap most acutely. I'm telling you this because I think the privacy community sometimes undersells the genuine difficulty of this transition in specific use cases. That dishonesty doesn't serve people who are actually trying to make informed decisions. For solo workers, freelancers, or people whose collaboration is mostly sharing finished files rather than simultaneous editing, the alternatives are entirely workable. For teams deeply embedded in Google Workspace workflows, the transition requires either more friction tolerance or more coordination with collaborators to get everyone onto alternative platforms together. Neither of those is impossible. Both of them are real. Google Photos is, I think, one of the most underappreciated privacy concerns in the entire Google ecosystem. And I say that as someone who uses a lot of Google services and understands broadly what each of them collects. Think about what Google Photos actually has access to. It has every photograph you've ever uploaded to it. It uses visual recognition to identify the people in those photos, including people who have never consented to being analyzed by Google. It identifies locations, objects, activities, and events. It tracks whose face appears with whose and how frequently. It builds a visual record of your relationships, your life, your family, your friends, your health, your home, all analyzed and filed and cross-referenced with everything else Google knows about you. That's not an abstract privacy concern. It's a highly concrete one. My replacement was Image, which is a self-hosted photo management solution that runs on a home server. I'll be direct. This is the most technically demanding transition in this entire list. Setting up self-hosted infrastructure requires comfort with Server-O, software that most people don't have and shouldn't be expected to develop just to manage their photos privately. If that's not you, Photos is a hosted alternative with end-to-end encryption that prevents even the service provider from accessing the content of your images. The honest trade-off here is functional. The semantic search that makes Google Photos genuinely magical. The ability to type Beach 2019 or red jacket or birthday cake and have it actually work. Well, it depends on exactly the analysis of your images that these privacy-preserving alternatives don't perform. You are trading a feature for protection from surveillance. That trade is real, and you should make it with open eyes. For me, it was worth it. For you, only you can make that call. YouTube is the one category that required a fundamentally different approach, because YouTube doesn't have a real functional equivalent. There is no alternative platform with YouTube's catalog of content. You know, the knowledge, the tutorials, the documentaries, the creators, the archives, they exist on YouTube and nowhere else at anything close to the same scale. Pretending otherwise would be dishonest. What does exist is a different way to consume that content. One that severs the data collection relationship without requiring you to give up access to the content itself. Invidious is an open source front end for YouTube that lets you watch YouTube's content without Google knowing you're watching it. No tracking cookies, no behavioral profile built from your viewing history, no algorithmic recommendation engine designed to maximize your time on platform by feeding you content engineered to keep you engaged regardless of whether it's actually good for you. The content is identical. The surveillance infrastructure is absent. For content that only exists on YouTube and that I genuinely want to watch, this is the practical solution. It preserves access, it eliminates the surveillance, and it removes the recommendation algorithm from the equation entirely, which turned out to have an effect on my media consumption habits that I didn't anticipate and that I'll come back to in a moment. There's a dimension of what changed after 18 months without Google that I couldn't have articulated before I lived it, and I want to try to describe it accurately because I think it's the most important part of this whole story. When Google Search is personalizing your results based on your search history, you are seeing the internet through a filter shaped by who Google's algorithm believes you to be based on what you've previously searched. You are not discovering things that don't fit the profile you've already built. You're getting increasingly refined versions of what the algorithm predicts you want, which is not the same thing as what you actually need or what's actually true. Without that personalization, my search results started showing me things that weren't pre-filtered through my behavioral history. That sounds small. It wasn't. I started finding primary sources I wouldn't have found inside Google's personalized bubble. I found perspectives that didn't fit neatly into the categories I'd established through my prior search behavior. The internet felt larger in a way that's genuinely hard to describe until you've experienced the contrast. Without Gmail, the advertising I saw on other platforms stopped reflecting the content of my email conversations in the eerie, specific way it had before. If you've ever emailed a friend about, say, planning a trip to Japan and then seen Japan tourism ads follow you around the web for 2 weeks, you know exactly what I'm talking about. That stopped. Without Google Maps logging my physical movements, the most physically intimate dimension of Google's data collection about me, the record of where my body actually goes in the physical world, ceased to be updated. That's not a small thing. Your physical location data reveals things about you that no amount of search history or email analysis can fully replicate. Your medical appointments, your places of worship, your relationship patterns, your financial behavior, your political activities. And without the YouTube algorithm feeding me content based on my viewing history, my media consumption changed. I started watching fewer videos overall, but more intentionally. When you have to actively choose what to watch, rather than being fed an infinite queue of algorithmically selected next videos, you watch less and engage more. I didn't expect that. It's been one of the most positive side effects of this entire experiment. None of this happened overnight, and I want to close with practical guidance rather than just a philosophical argument, because the philosophy only matters if you can actually do something with it. The approach that worked for me was not a sudden, comprehensive break with Google. It was sequential and deliberate. Start with one service, just one. Identify the Google service that concerns you most from a privacy perspective. Find the best alternative for your specific use case and use it as your primary tool in that category for 2 weeks. Evaluate the result from your actual experience, not from your anxiety about what the experience might be like. For most people, that first service should be email. Proton Mail is the most functionally comparable alternative to Gmail that currently exists. The transition is manageable. The adjustment period is real but short. And once you've completed it, you have direct evidence from your own experience that the alternative is good enough, which makes the next transition feel less daunting, and the one after that even less so. The second transition I'd recommend is search, starting with DuckDuckGo before deciding whether Kagi's paid model is worth the investment for your usage. The third depends on your specific workflow. If you're an individual worker, Drive and Photos. If you're mobile heavy, Maps. What I can tell you with complete certainty after 18 months is this. The alternative ecosystem in 2026 is mature enough for this to be a practical choice for most people, willing to give the transitions the time and attention they require in the early weeks. The tools are good. The gap between them and Google's services is real in some areas and non-existent in others, but in no category was the gap large enough to send me back. What I cannot promise you is that every alternative will match every Google service in every dimension. That would be dishonest. And this whole experience has been about trying to make choices based on an honest accounting of trade-offs rather than accepting trade-offs I hadn't consciously evaluated. Here's the honest version of what I found. The things you lose are real but smaller than you think. The things you gain, ownership of your data, control over your digital identity, a relationship with your tools that isn't built on behavioral surveillance, are also real, and in my experience, larger than I expected. 18 months later, I don't miss Google. I miss almost nothing about the version of my digital life that was running inside Google's ecosystem. And the alternative version of that life, the one built on tools whose business models are aligned with my interests, rather than with selling my behavioral data to advertisers, feels qualitatively different in a way that is, for me, worth every bit of the work it took to get here. The only question is whether it's worth it for you, and the only way to know that is to actually try.